On a warm May afternoon in 1970, the air in Gormley, Ontario was thick with the scent of blossoming spring. Windows were open, doors were unlocked, and a profound sense of security hung like a silent promise over the quiet rural community. But inside one of those homes, a silence fell that was anything but peaceful, a final absolute silence. And beneath it, a tiny, breathing miracle trapped in a horror it was too young to comprehend. The evil that arrived shattered more than just a family. It tore through the very fabric of trust that held these small towns together. Two women, two mothers targeted with chilling precision, and a killer who vanished into the long dark shadow of the innocent, leaving behind only fear, unanswered questions, and a nickname whispered in hushed tones, the .22 caliber killer. Before we delve into this chilling story, tell us in the comments below, where are you watching after the silence from today? This is the true story of how a hidden monster brought a peaceful community to its knees, and how the search for justice would span nearly 3 decades. May 6, 1970. A day painted in the gentle hues of burgeoning spring settled over Gormley, Ontario. The rural landscape, just a short drive north of Toronto, was a tableau of quiet contentment. Green fields stretched towards the horizon, punctuated by stands of mature trees, their leaves unfurling in vibrant shades. The air itself seemed to hum with an understated peace, carrying the mingled scents of warming earth, freshly cut grass, and the sweet perfume of lilacs blooming in cottage gardens. In this serene tableau, where the rhythm of life was dictated by the seasons and the close-knit bonds of community, the very notion of malevolence felt alien, a distant echo from the urban centers of other cities. Here in Gormley, it was customary for front doors to remain unlatched, for windows to be flung wide to invite the gentle breeze, and for a profound, unspoken sense of security to permeate every corner of daily existence. It was a promise, silently upheld, that life would continue in its predictable, comforting course. Albert Morby, a man whose life was anchored in quiet dedication, moved through the familiar routines of his profession. As a respected schoolteacher, his days unfolded within the structured cadence of the classroom. He stood before his students at the local school, his voice a steady, reassuring presence as he expounded on the complexities of algebra or guided them through the annals of Canadian history. The scent of chalk dust and old paper mingled with the faint, sweet smell of spring wafting in through open windows. Even amidst the demands of his calling, his thoughts, though focused and precise, frequently drifted, a soft, warm current, toward his home. He pictured Doreen, his beloved wife, a vibrant 34 years old, her energy devoted to their spirited 21-month-old son. Their life together was a tapestry, woven with shared dreams and simple pleasures, a comforting predictability that formed the bedrock of Albert's world. The anticipation of returning to their warmth, to the familiar sounds and the gentle embrace of his family, was a quiet, steady joy that underpinned his every action. When the final school bell chimed its liberating chorus, signaling the end of the day, Albert gathered his materials. The rustle of papers, a counterpoint to the tranquil haste of a man eager to return to his haven. The short drive home was bathed in the soft, golden light of the late afternoon. Albert navigated the familiar winding roads, his mind still pleasantly occupied with the day's events, perhaps a humorous anecdote from a student or a mental note to discuss a school matter with Doreen. He imagined the usual scene that awaited him, the savory scent of dinner wafting from the kitchen, the soft murmur of the radio tuned to one of Doreen's preferred stations, perhaps the cheerful babbling of their son emanating from the nursery. As he guided his car into the driveway of their modest, comfortable home, an unexpected stillness greeted him. The familiar sounds were conspicuously absent. No distant melody, no cheerful clatter of pots and pans, no playful cries from his child. A subtle tremor of unease, barely perceptible at first, traced its way up his spine. He retrieved his keys, a habit more than a necessity in Gormley, and unlocked the front door. The click of the tumblers echoed in an unnatural quiet. Stepping inside, Albert found the air thick, heavy, devoid of the usual domestic energy. The absence of sound was not merely a lack of noise, but a palpable void, an oppressive stillness that pressed in on him. "Doreen?" he called out, his voice a little softer than intended, a hesitant question rather than an assertion. Only the echo of his own voice answered him, swallowed by the profound silence. He called again, louder this time, a thread of apprehension beginning to weave its way into his tone, tightening in his throat. Still no reply. A cold dread began to coil in his stomach, replacing the pleasant anticipation of moments before. His heart, which had been beating with the even rhythm of contentedness, now began a frantic, insistent drum against his ribs. He moved through the living room, each step accelerating, his initial cautiousness giving way to a desperate urgency. The kitchen was deserted, the stove cold, the radio silent, a silent sentinel on the counter. The half-finished morning coffee cup still sat on the table. He checked the nursery, the small cot neatly made, the usual assortment of toys tucked away but empty. The bathroom, the utility room, the laundry area, all offered the same chilling emptiness. His breath hitched in his throat, each inhale a shallow, ragged gasp, as he finally approached the master bedroom. The door stood slightly ajar, a sliver of deeper shadow within, beckoning him towards an unknown dread. What he witnessed within that room would forever fracture the foundational sense of security and innocence that had defined Gormley. Doreen Morby lay crumpled on the floor, her body a still lifeless tableau. The vibrant warmth and effervescent spirit that had been her essence were brutally extinguished, replaced by a profound, chilling cold that seemed to emanate from the very air of the room, clinging to everything. She had been subjected to a brutal sexual assault, the grim evidence stark and undeniable, a sickening violation of her person. Her life had been ended with a terrifying, almost surgical precision, 7 distinct shots from a .22 caliber firearm. 5 had struck her head, 2 in her back. The methodical nature of the execution, the deliberate placement of each fatal wound, spoke not of impulsive rage, but of a calculated, chilling cruelty that defied immediate human comprehension. And there, beneath her motionless form, shielded in a final, involuntary act of maternal protection, lay their 21-month-old son. He was physically unharmed, a tiny, breathing miracle amidst the horror. His small hand still clutching a toy, but an unwitting, silent witness to a scene so unspeakable, it would forever mark him in ways his infant mind could not yet process. Albert's scream, a primal guttural sound, raw and visceral, tore through the unnatural silence, a pure agony that shattered the deceptive peace of the late afternoon and echoed through the silent house. He fell to his knees, his world collapsing around him. The sirens that followed, piercing the quiet rural evening with their urgent wailing chorus, ripped through Gormley's illusion of inviolability. Their mournful sound grew louder, closer, then faded as patrol cars, their flashing lights casting an eerie, rhythmic strobe against the darkening landscape, descended upon the Morby residence. The once peaceful street was transformed into a chaotic hub of emergency vehicles and grim-faced officers. The news spread like wildfire, carried by hushed phone calls, panicked whispers across back fences, and the visible expressions of shock and terror on the faces of neighbors gathering tentatively at the end of their driveways. It consumed the community's collective sense of security in its rapid, devastating spread. Gormley, a place where people left their doors open, where children played freely until the last vestiges of sunset, where the biggest worries were seasonal harvests or local gossip, awakened abruptly to an entirely new and terrifying reality. Suddenly, locks were engaged. Curtains were drawn earlier, pulled tight against the unseen threat that now lurked beyond the glass. Mothers clutched their children tighter, a new, unspoken fear gripping them as they tucked their little ones into bed, wondering if the monster was still out there, lurking in the shadows of their once safe world. The unspoken promise of safety, once an absolute, had been violently, irrevocably broken. The Ontario Provincial Police, OPP, responded with the full weight of their resources, immediately assembling a massive task force dedicated solely to the murder of Doreen Morby. Dozens of seasoned investigators, their faces grim and determined, descended upon the Moorby residence, transforming the peaceful home into a meticulously controlled, grim laboratory. Forensic teams working under the harsh glare of portable lamps and the cool analytical focus of their training, painstakingly processed every inch of the crime scene. They documented, photographed and carefully collected every fragment of evidence available to them in 1970. Hair fibers, potential fingerprints from surfaces, ballistic evidence meticulously retrieved, and any other microscopic trace that could link to the perpetrator. This was a painstaking process, slow and deliberate, a testament to the scale of the horror they were confronting and the critical need for precision. Every item was bagged, tagged and catalogued, each a potential key to unlocking the mystery. Officers fanned out across Gormley and its surrounding areas, initiating an exhaustive series of interviews. Neighbours, friends, distant acquaintances, even strangers reported as having been seen in the vicinity. No one was exempt from questioning. The collective memory of the community was sifted through, desperate for any detail, any inconsistency, any fragment of information that could shed light on the monster responsible. Patrol cars crisscrossed the country roads, their presence a constant reminder of the tragedy that had befallen the community. Over the initial weeks and months, a staggering number of individuals, more than 3,000, would eventually be questioned in the sprawling, relentless investigation, their lives briefly intersecting with the horror that had shattered Doreen Morby's. Among the numerous uniforms on the ground, a young constable from the Toronto Police Department, Ronald Glenn West, was present. At 23 years old, he was a relatively fresh face in law enforcement. Having joined the force in 1966, West diligently participated in the initial searches, assisted with door-to-door canvassing in neighboring areas, and meticulously took notes during interviews, carefully documenting witness statements. He moved with an efficient, if somewhat reserved, demeanor. He was one of countless officers brought in to bolster the OPP's efforts, a small, diligent cog in a massive investigative machine. His presence at the crime scene, his methodical movements, and his contributions to the early stages of the investigation were, at the time, entirely unremarkable, simply that of a dutiful young officer performing his duty. He blended seamlessly into the chaotic, determined efforts of law enforcement, observing the grief and fear that permeated the community, absorbing the raw details of the crime alongside his colleagues. Yet, in those initial frantic days, the sheer volume of questions far outweighed the answers. Who would commit such an act of barbarity? Why Doreen Morby? She was a registered nurse, a well-liked woman, an active and valued member of her community. Her husband, Albert, was a respected teacher. The couple had no known enemies, no hidden past that could offer a glimpse into such extreme violence. There was no apparent motive for such an extreme act. The house showed no signs of forced entry. The front door had been locked by Albert, implying the victim either knew her attacker or willingly opened the door to him. The precision of the execution, combined with the sexual assault, pointed to a disturbed and calculating individual, but without a clear pattern, a distinct connection to the victim, or any strong leads. Investigators were left grappling in the dark. The perpetrator had left little behind beyond the devastating aftermath. The lack of concrete leads was baffling, the sheer brutality of the crime, leaving even seasoned investigators disoriented and frustrated. A profound shadow of distrust, unfamiliar and chilling, settled over Gormley. Every unfamiliar car that passed through, every unannounced knock at the door, every distant, unexplained sound in the night became a source of immediate apprehension. The perpetrator had vanished as completely as he had appeared, leaving behind only the cold silence of death, the indelible trauma of a family shattered, and the pervasive, suffocating grip of fear that now enveloped the once secure community. The monster, it seemed, was still out there, possibly among them, hidden in plain sight, an unseen predator waiting in the long shadows of Gormley. The initial shock began to crystallize into a deep-seated anxiety, a chilling understanding that their world had fundamentally, terrifyingly changed. 13 days. That was the brief, agonizing span of time before the unspeakable horror that had gripped Gormley resurfaced, echoing with chilling precision in another quiet rural community. The fear, which had just begun to settle into a numbing dread in Gormley, was about to metastasize, spreading its insidious tendrils across the unsuspecting expanse north of Toronto. May 19th, 1970. The spring afternoon in Palgrave. Ontario was, like Gormley, imbued with the deceptive tranquility of the countryside. Palgrave shared more than just geographical proximity with its afflicted neighbour. It mirrored Gormley's pastoral charm, its tightly woven community fabric, and its deep-seated belief in an inherent safety. Here, nestled amidst rolling hills and mature woodlands, lived Margaret Ferguson. At 38 years old, Margaret was, like Doreen Morby, a registered nurse. She was married to a teacher, a man whose days were spent in classrooms much like Albert Morby. And, like Doreen, Margaret was a mother, her home filled with the lively energy of her children, including a 9-year-old son who was particularly fond of tinkering with model airplanes in his bedroom. Margaret's routine, too, held a familiar comfort. Her day had unfolded with the usual domestic rhythms. She had seen her husband off to school, managed the morning chores, perhaps chatted with a neighbor over the phone about a local bake sale. The afternoon was given to the children, the eldest engrossed in his plastic models, the younger ones perhaps playing outdoors. It was a common day, unremarkable in its predictability, a testament to the peaceful life the Fergusons had cultivated in their isolated rural home. The house itself, a charming but somewhat secluded property, offered the privacy and quiet characteristic of the region, a feature that, unbeknownst to the family, might have made it a target. Around mid-afternoon, Margaret's 9-year-old son, deeply engrossed in assembling an intricate model Spitfire, heard the familiar chime of the doorbell. From his bedroom, a comforting distance from the front entrance, he heard his mother's footsteps, light and purposeful, moving towards the door. The familiar sound of the latch clicking open followed, a brief pause, then a muffled exchange of voices. The precise content of the conversation was lost to the hum of his own focused activity and the general ambient sounds of the house. He imagined a salesman, perhaps a deliveryman, or even a neighbor stopping by for an unexpected visit. Such occurrences were not uncommon in their community. He continued to meticulously affix a tiny wing to his miniature aircraft. Then, the world outside his immediate concentration fractured. 3 distinct sounds, sharp and abrupt, tore through the quiet afternoon. Crack, crack, crack. They were dry, acute, definitive. Sounds he had never heard before, yet instinctively understood to be wrong. The kind of sounds that instantly demand attention, that silence all other thoughts. They echoed through the seemingly stout walls of the house, reverberating with a terrifying finality. For a 9-year-old, the meaning of such a sequence of noises might have been ambiguous in theory, but the sudden absolute silence that followed was not. It was the complete cessation of life. The silence stretched, long and terrifying, punctuated only by the frantic beat of his own small heart. Frozen in his room, the model airplane forgotten, the boy waited. He expected to hear his mother's voice, perhaps a startled exclamation or the closing of the front door, but there was nothing. Only the creeping, suffocating silence. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only moments, a primal fear impelled him to move. He slowly, cautiously pushed open his bedroom door, peering into the hallway. The house was utterly still. He crept forward, his bare feet silent on the wooden floor drawn by an invisible, horrific magnet. As he reached the front entrance, the sight that met his eyes would forever be seared into his memory. Margaret Ferguson lay just beyond the threshold, her body contorted, motionless. She had answered the door to a stranger, and in doing so had opened it to a monstrous fate. 3 gunshots, fired with the same chilling precision as those that had claimed Doreen Morby, 1 to her head, 2 to her back. The same signature, the same .22 caliber weapon. The initial responders found Margaret in a scene that chillingly mirrored the one just 13 days prior. The sexual violation had preceded the murder, a grim and brutal parallel. And, as in the first crime, the child, though a witness to the horrific event, had been miraculously spared. The 9-year-old, shaken but physically unharmed, was quickly removed from the scene by a neighbor who had been alerted by the commotion. But the question loomed cold and terrifying. Why? Why had the children in both instances been left untouched, yet forced to bear witness to such unimaginable brutality? The repetition of the crimes with their disturbing similarities sent shockwaves far beyond Gormley and Palgrave. The provincial police, already stretched thin by the Morby case, now confronted a horrifying realization. They were dealing with a serial killer. The parallels were too stark to ignore. Both victims were nurses. Both were married to teachers. Both were mothers. Both lived in relatively isolated rural homes. Both had been sexually assaulted. Both had been executed with a .22 caliber firearm. The pattern was glaring, screaming its presence, yet the underlying motivation, the invisible thread connecting these women, remained elusive. The media, seizing upon the terrifying consistency, quickly bestowed a chilling moniker upon the unseen predator, the .22 caliber killer. The name, at once journalistic and chillingly cinematic, became a grim incantation, whispered in homes and shouted from newspaper headlines, carrying the crushing weight of a very real and present terror. The panic that had begun as a localized dread in Gormley now spread like a virulent contagion across the entire rural expanse north of Toronto. The collective sense of security, already fragile, completely disintegrated. People stopped answering their doors to strangers. Even familiar faces were viewed with a new, unsettling suspicion. Women, particularly those living in isolated homes, grew increasingly reluctant to be left alone. Husbands returning from work would call ahead, their voices laced with an anxiety that had been entirely absent just weeks before. Schools considered releasing students early or implementing stricter pickup protocols as parents expressed palpable fears for their children's safety. The vibrant hum of community life was replaced by a low thrum of constant anxiety, a fear of the unknown. The investigation intensified dramatically. What had been a large task force was now an even more massive undertaking. A race against time to stop a predator who was clearly escalating. More investigators were brought in, their faces etched with the pressure of a community in turmoil. They pored over crime scene reports, looking for microscopic differences, subtle deviations, any detail that might distinguish the two events. Ballistics confirmed the same weapon had been used in both murders. Psychological profiles were developed, revised, and then discarded as new, often conflicting information emerged. The focus narrowed to finding connections between Doreen and Margaret. Had they worked at the same hospital, even briefly? Did they have mutual friends, distant relatives? Had they ever crossed paths in a professional or social setting? Yet initial inquiries yielded no obvious links. Their lives on the surface did not intersect. The killer's selection criteria, though consistent, remained maddeningly obscure. Was he targeting specific individuals or a type of woman, randomly chosen from the vastness of the rural landscape? Amidst this maelstrom of fear and confusion, a small, largely unnoticed change occurred within the massive investigative team. Ronald Glenn West, the young constable from Toronto who had diligently participated in the initial Gormley investigation, requested a transfer out of the region. He cited personal reasons, a desire for a change of pace, a need to move on from the harrowing events that had unfolded. Some of his colleagues, seasoned veterans who had seen many horrific scenes, noted his apparent distress. They saw a young officer, perhaps overwhelmed by the sheer brutality and the grim nature of the double homicide investigation, opting for a less intense environment. It was not uncommon for younger officers to be deeply affected by such cases, to seek a change after witnessing the darkest aspects of humanity. He seemed a bit shaken, one detective might have commented to another over a late-night coffee, poring over stacks of witness statements. Couldn't really stomach it, I suppose. It's a tough business. Another might have simply nodded in agreement, understanding the toll such cases could take. In an investigation of this magnitude, with dozens of officers cycling through various roles, the departure of a relatively junior constable barely registered as a blip. There were too many leads to chase, too many interviews to conduct, too much collective grief and fear to contend with. His colleagues, entirely without suspicion, simply attributed his request to the psychological toll of the cases, a common, understandable reaction to the gruesome reality of their work. West's departure, though noted, was quickly overshadowed by the relentless, increasingly desperate search for a killer who seemed to exist as a ghost, leaving only death and unanswered questions in his terrifying wake. The lack of concrete progress, despite the clear pattern, began to breed a deep-seated frustration within law enforcement and a growing despair within the communities living under the shadow of the .22 caliber killer. The urgent wail of sirens eventually faded, replaced by a lingering, unsettling quiet that settled like a shroud across the rural communities north of Toronto. The initial fury of the investigation into the brutal murders of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson, fueled by twin tragedies and widespread panic, gradually began to wane. Days bled into weeks, then months, and still, no concrete leads emerged. No strong suspects solidified into actionable arrests. The massive, intensive house-to-house canvassing, The thousands of interviews conducted across two separate communities, the painstaking yet ultimately limited forensic analysis of the era, all had yielded a mountain of fragmented information. Yet this vast collection of data, rather than illuminating a clear path to the truth, seemed to obscure it further, creating a labyrinth of dead ends, frustrating ambiguities, and unanswerable questions. Without fresh evidence, a compelling breakthrough, or a credible confession, the cases slowly began to cool. The initial task force, a coordinated effort involving dozens of officers, forensic specialists, and administrative support, gradually scaled back its operations. Officers were reassigned to new active investigations, their caseloads pulling them towards fresh tragedies and urgent inquiries. The fervent demands for justice from the shocked public, while never truly extinguished, softened into a weary, collective resignation as the relentless cycle of news shifted focus and new crises or captivating stories captured the collective attention. The memory of the .22 caliber killer, once a screaming immediate terror, receded from the forefront of public consciousness, slowly transforming from a palpable, lurking threat into something more spectral, a haunting whisper on the periphery of local memory. The physical files documenting the murders of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson grew thick, then voluminous, eventually filling entire cabinets within the cold case divisions of the Ontario Provincial Police Headquarters. Bound meticulously with aging twine or secured with stiff metal fasteners and labeled with stark dates and victim names, they contained an exhaustive, yet ultimately inconclusive, record. Inside these folders, detectives, both contemporary and successive generations, would find detailed crime scene photographs, their colors muted by time, but their content still stark and disturbing. There were yellowing witness statements, transcribed notes from interviews that stretched into the thousands, intricate ballistic reports confirming the identical .22 caliber weapon used in both attacks, and the early, rudimentary attempts at psychological profiling that reflected the limited understanding of serial predation in the early 1970s. Each page, each photograph, each meticulously preserved piece of evidence represented a fragment of a life violently ended, a question desperately posed by heartbroken families, and a lead fruitlessly pursued by dedicated officers. Yet despite the meticulous record-keeping, the exhaustive efforts and the passage of time, no resolution emerged. The killer had disappeared as thoroughly as he had arrived, a phantom haunting the collective memory of the communities he had terrorized, leaving behind only grief and an enduring enigma. Life, with its inherent stubbornness, found a way to continue. The initial paralyzing fear that had gripped Gormley and Palgrave began to recede, replaced by a more subdued, yet deeply ingrained, caution. The casual habits of rural living were fundamentally altered. Doors that had once been left unlatched in a gesture of neighborly trust now remained firmly locked day and night. Windows, once flung wide to invite the gentle summer breeze, were now more often kept shut, or fitted with new, sturdier screens. Children still played outdoors, their laughter still echoing through the fields, but always under the closer, more watchful eyes of parents. These parents, their voices hushed, would whisper warnings about not opening the door to strangers, often invoking the chilling legend of the .22 caliber killer as a macabre cautionary tale, a dark fable to instill a necessary vigilance. The memory of the murders, though no longer an active, immediate threat to daily life, persisted as a deeply unsettling urban legend, a dark stain on the otherwise idyllic landscape of central Ontario. It was a shared trauma that subtly yet irrevocably altered the fabric of trust in small-town Ontario, embedding a silent, chilling understanding that evil could indeed knock on any door, even in the most ostensibly protected of places. The communities learned to live with the unanswered questions, but they never truly forgot. But in the quiet corridors of justice, in the unassuming, often overlooked offices of detectives who carried the indelible weight of unresolved cases, there were those who simply could not forget. Detective Inspector Don McNeil was one such man. A veteran of the Ontario Provincial Police, McNeil was known throughout the force for his methodical approach, his unwavering commitment to justice, and a deep-seated refusal to accept unsolved as a definitive final outcome. He possessed an almost encyclopedic memory for cases, and a professional stubbornness that bordered on legend. For him, Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson were not simply names on dusty folders, statistics in a cold case registry, or faded images in a forgotten archive. They were women whose lives had been brutally cut short, whose families had been irrevocably shattered, and whose voices had been silenced. They were victims who deserved justice, whose stories in his unwavering mind remained unfinished. He carried their cases not as a burdensome weight, but as a profound personal mission, a quiet, unyielding fire burning beneath his composed, often somber exterior. He understood the immense frustration of a cold trail, the despair of exhausted leads, the bureaucratic hurdles that often accompanied decades-old investigations, but he steadfastly refused to surrender to any of it. He routinely revisited the files, sometimes just sitting with the boxes, sifting through reports, looking for a detail he might have missed, a connection that might have been overlooked in the initial chaos. He would reread witness statements, studying them for nuances, for faint echoes of truth that might have been lost in the passage of time. As the 1980s dawned and began its slow march towards a new millennium, a new wave of scientific advancement began to crest in the field of forensic science. The nascent stages of DNA analysis started to emerge from the realm of academic theory into the practical application of criminal investigations. What had once been the stuff of ambitious scientific papers and futuristic speculation was slowly, meticulously becoming a tangible reality. The ability to identify an individual from microscopic biological evidence with astonishing precision. MacNeil, ever the meticulous and forward-thinking investigator, paid close attention to these revolutionary developments. He attended specialized seminars, devoured scientific journals and technical papers on genetic fingerprinting, and diligently engaged with early forensic specialists and geneticists, absorbing every detail of this new, groundbreaking science. He recognized its profound potential, a glimmer of hope in the often dark landscape of cold cases. He knew, with an almost prescient certainty, that the crime scenes of 1970, though processed with the best available techniques of their time, had been handled with an admirable, almost intuitive care. Crucial evidence, minute biological material potentially left by the assailant, had been diligently collected, painstakingly labeled, and carefully preserved. At the time, its full potential was unknown, its significance only partially understood. But MacNeil, through his foresight and dedication, ensured that these vital fragments were meticulously stored, kept in conditions that would allow for future analysis. He recognized that these preserved fragments, these silent witnesses from decades past, might one day hold the absolute key, offering a definitive voice to the victims long after the initial trail had gone cold. He understood that a case was only truly cold when hope for new evidence died, and for Detective Inspector MacNeil, that flame of hope, however faint it might have seemed to others, never truly flickered out. It was a distant yet persistent beacon guiding his efforts. Then in 1988, a curious, seemingly minor event occurred that would, in the fullness of time, take on a chilling and profound significance. Ronald Glenn West, the young constable from Toronto, who had discreetly transferred out of the Toronto police force in 1972, not long after the Ferguson murder, made his way back to the region. By this point, West was no longer the fresh-faced 23-year-old officer who had walked the perimeters of the Gormley crime scene. He was now a man in his early 40s, 41 years old, carrying more years, more life experience, but still seemed to embody a quiet, somewhat reserved demeanor. His life since leaving the police force had, on the surface, been relatively unremarkable, a quiet existence devoid of major incident, or so it seemed to casual observers. He did not speak much about the old cases, the Gormley and Palgrave murders. After all, so many years had passed, and to many they were simply tragic footnotes in local history, a grim reminder of a bygone era. But for some of the veteran investigators who still remembered the frantic days of 1970, those who had, perhaps shared a coffee with the young constable or seen him diligently taking notes at a crime scene, West's reappearance, coupled with some subtle inconsistencies in his narrative about his time away, caused a faint flicker of internal speculation. These were not red flags waving overtly, no direct links to the cold cases, but rather faint whispers of discord in an otherwise unremarkable story. There were vague gaps in his employment history, brief periods that were not easily accounted for, or slightly evasive explanations when asked about certain past activities. These were not damning pieces of evidence, but rather the kind of minor discrepancies that might make an experienced investigator, like a MacNeil, furrow his brow with a faint, almost imperceptible sense of disquiet. At the time, such inconsistencies were easily dismissed as commonplace. People sometimes moved, changed jobs, or simply preferred to keep details of their past private. There was certainly not enough concrete information to warrant a deeper investigation, nor was there any perceived link between West and the unsolved murders. His colleagues, entirely without suspicion, simply attributed his past departure and current reticence to a desire for privacy or the natural evolution of a man's life. West's return, though noted by a few, was quickly overshadowed by the relentless, often frustrating, pursuit of a killer who seemed to exist as a ghost, leaving only death and unanswered questions in his terrifying wake. The threads of a dormant truth, however, had just stirred, patiently awaiting the dawn of a new forensic era and the relentless pursuit of a detective who refused to let the past remain buried. The quiet return of Ronald Glenn West was, in hindsight, a subtle, unsettling harbinger, an almost imperceptible tremor beneath the surface of a seemingly quiet life, hinting at a darker current yet to be fully exposed. The 1990s had unfurled, marking nearly 2 decades since the horrific events that had abruptly shattered the peace of Gormley and Palgrave. Society had undergone profound shifts. Technology had advanced at an accelerating pace, cultural norms had evolved, and the world had moved on in countless ways. Yet for the families of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson, and for Detective Inspector Don MacNeil, the relentless march of time had done little to dull the sharp edges of an unresolved tragedy. For the public, the cases had faded into the annals of cold case history, a grim and haunting memory, but for MacNeil they remained a burning, persistent question, a puzzle whose crucial pieces he instinctively knew were still out there, patiently awaiting discovery. It was during this decade that a seemingly unrelated series of events would, against all odds, provide the crucial turning point MacNeil had quietly, patiently, almost obsessively awaited. Ronald Glenn West, the former young constable who had briefly returned to the region in 1988, now a man in his late 40s, found himself on the wrong side of the law. West, whose life after his discreet departure from the Toronto police force in 1972 had appeared outwardly unremarkable, a period of relative anonymity, of quietly blending into new communities, had unbeknownst to most embarked on a darker, more predatory path. His criminal activities came to light when he was apprehended for a series of violent armed robberies that had plagued various towns across Ontario. These were not the impulsive acts of a desperate petty thief. They were calculated, aggressive and often terrifying encounters, frequently involving the brandishing or overt use of a firearm to intimidate and subdue his victims. The brazen nature of these offenses was deeply unsettling, particularly given his past as a law enforcement officer, a man once sworn to uphold the very laws he now so violently transgressed. The pattern of his robberies revealed a cold, methodical approach, a chilling echo of the precision observed in the 1970 murders. The arrest of a former police constable for such violent felonies sent ripples of shock and disbelief through the justice system, and the communities impacted. The irony was stark, unsettling, and profoundly disturbing. A man who had once worn a uniform, pledged to protect and serve, now stood accused of being a predatory criminal, terrorizing the very citizens he had once sworn to safeguard. The judicial process unfolded with a grim efficiency. West was meticulously investigated, formally charged, and subsequently brought to trial. The evidence against him for the robberies was compelling, leading to his conviction. He was sentenced to a significant term of imprisonment for armed robbery and the use of a firearm during the commission of a crime. He was then remanded to Joyceville Penitentiary, a maximum security federal institution situated in Kingston, Ontario, its imposing stone walls a stark monument to the Canadian penal system. Behind the formidable walls and razor wire of Joyceville, Ronald Glenn West, now in his late 40s to early 50s, began his new life as inmate Theranosxxx, far removed from the quiet rural communities he had once patrolled and, as the passage of time would tragically reveal, terrorized. News of West's incarceration reached Detective Inspector McNeil, not through a direct targeted lead in the cold cases, but through the routine channels of police intelligence bulletins and internal newsletters that circulated within the OPP. McNeil, by this point, was a seasoned veteran, his face etched with the experiences of decades in law enforcement, his mind a steel trap for details. He was in his element amidst the complex web of ongoing investigations, but his unwavering commitment to the Morby and Ferguson murders had never once faltered. The names Doreen and Margaret were not just etched into his professional consciousness, they were an intrinsic part of his personal ethos. Their unsolved cases a quiet, yet persistent demand for justice that echoed in his daily work. The moment he learned of West's imprisonment, a connection, tenuous yet compelling, sparked in his methodical mind. It wasn't simply that West was an ex-cop now behind bars. It was the confluence of factors, the timing, the location of his current crimes, and McNeil's inherent distrust of any narrative that left questions unanswered, especially when subtle inconsistencies from the past lingered. He remembered West's quiet departure from the force, the vague reasons, the unsettling feeling from his brief return in '88. Now West was not just a name. He was a convicted violent offender, a man whose DNA could now definitively be obtained. For years, McNeil had been closely, almost obsessively, following the burgeoning advancements in forensic science. The 1980s had introduced the theoretical concept of DNA profiling, but the technology was nascent, its applications limited by the minute quantities of biological material required and the sensitivity of the analytical methods available. It was largely a research tool, not yet a cornerstone of criminal investigation. However, by the mid-1990s, the field had undergone an exponential, breathtaking revolution. What was once considered a scientific long shot, a tantalizing glimpse into the future, was now becoming a routine, highly reliable, and incredibly powerful tool in criminal investigations. Modern DNA analysis techniques could now generate definitive profiles from incredibly small, even partially degraded biological samples. The ability to amplify minute traces, of DNA using polymerase chain reaction, PCR, and to pinpoint unique genetic markers through short tandem repeat, STR analysis had transformed forensic science from an art of educated guesswork into a science of irrefutable identification. McNeil saw West's conviction and subsequent incarceration not as an end to a criminal career, but as an unprecedented, critical opportunity, a chance to finally leverage this groundbreaking science against the cold, silent evidence of 1970. The pieces, after nearly 3 decades, were finally aligning. McNeil immediately initiated the arduous process to revisit the Morby and Ferguson cases. This was not a simple task. Decades-old cold cases, particularly those without active leads, often faced significant bureaucratic inertia, skepticism from superiors, and severe resource limitations. He had to meticulously present his argument to his commanding officers, detailing not only the exponential advancements in DNA technology, but also the compelling, if still circumstantial, shift in West's status from a fleeting, almost forgotten presence in 1970 to a convicted violent felon with a verifiable criminal record and, crucially, a DNA sample now available in a national database. McNeil emphasized that West's incarceration meant a definitive DNA sample could now be compared, a possibility that simply did not exist during the original rudimentary investigation. His unparalleled persistence, his sterling reputation within the OPP, and the undeniable promise of the new technology ultimately prevailed. With the necessary departmental approvals secured, McNeil formally ordered the reanalysis of the physical evidence meticulously preserved, some almost religiously so, from the Gormley and Palgrave crime scenes. The process began with the careful, almost reverent retrieval of the evidence boxes. These were not just folders. They were heavy, dust-laden cartons, stored for decades in climate-controlled archives, their labels bearing the fading official script of detectives long since retired or passed away. Each box was a time capsule, a sealed repository containing the raw, unfiltered remnants of 2 brutal crimes that had haunted a province. Inside were carefully sealed evidence bags, many yellowed with age, containing items that had been meticulously collected in 1970 with an admirable foresight. Fragments of cloth from Doreen Morby's nightgown, seminal fluid stains on fabrics, individual hairs found tangled in her clothing or on the bedsheets, and even microscopic traces of skin cells transferred during the struggle. Similarly, from the Margaret Ferguson case, more textile samples, biological fluids from the scene, and other minute evidentiary fragments had been preserved. These materials had been secured using the best practices of their era, sealed, catalogued, and meticulously stored, enduring decades in darkness, patiently waiting for a science that didn't yet exist to bring them to life. The critical responsibility for this delicate, utterly critical reanalysis fell to a team of highly skilled forensic technicians at the provincial laboratory. These dedicated scientists understood the immense weight of expectation that accompanied such high-profile cold cases. They donned sterile suits, multiple layers of gloves and face masks, working in meticulously controlled, pristine environments designed to prevent any possible contamination of the precious decades-old samples. The work was painstaking, requiring absolute precision, unwavering focus, and an almost artistic touch. Each piece of evidence was handled with the utmost reverence, carefully unpacked, placed under high-powered microscopes, and analyzed using techniques that had been unimaginable to the investigators of 1970. The first, most crucial step involved the meticulous extraction of any viable biological material from the aged samples. From fabric swatches, they carefully scraped away dried fluid stains, rehydrating them with specialized solutions. Individual hairs were examined for the presence of follicles, the precious root material that contained the cellular DNA. Microscopic skin cells, possibly shed by the perpetrator during the violent struggles or sexual assaults, were carefully isolated from clothing fibers, bedding, or other surfaces at the crime scenes. This was a process of scientific archaeology, a painstaking excavation for genetic treasures hidden within samples that were often degraded by time, fluctuations in temperature, and various environmental factors. Once extracted, even the minute amounts of DNA were then amplified using state-of-the-art polymerase chain reaction, PCR techniques, creating millions of identical copies from what might have originally been only a handful of cells. This amplified DNA was then subjected to restriction fragment length polymorphism, RFLP, and, more commonly in the 90s, short tandem repeat STR analysis, which allowed the technicians to identify specific, highly variable regions of the DNA that are unique to each individual. From these complex patterns of genetic markers, a definitive DNA profile, a unique genetic fingerprint of the assailant, was painstakingly constructed for both the Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson cases. The profiles were astonishingly clear, robust, and unambiguous, a stark contrast to the vague blood typing and serological tests of decades past. The tension in the lab was palpable as these newly generated DNA profiles were prepared for comparison. The scientific objective was clear: to find a match. The first step was to compare these profiles against existing criminal DNA databases, rapidly expanding repositories of genetic information from convicted offenders across the country. This was a broad, systematic search, a digital dragnet cast across a vast sea of stored genetic data. Simultaneously, McNeil ensured the profiles were also compared against DNA samples, where available, from the thousands of suspects and persons of interest who had been interviewed during the original 1970 investigation. These samples, often collected years ago for other, sometimes unrelated purposes, were now revisited with the powerful, unblinking lens of modern forensics. The forensic technicians worked late into the nights, their screens glowing with complex data, their focus absolute, fueled by strong coffee and an acute awareness of the history embedded in the samples they were analyzing. Each negative result, each non-match, was a quiet disappointment, a momentary sigh, but it also systematically narrowed the field of potential suspects. The anticipation grew with each passing day, a slow, relentless tightening in the air of the laboratory. McNeil, receiving regular, often terse updates, felt the slow, steady drumbeat of hope quicken within him. After almost 3 decades of silence, after countless dead ends and the profound anonymity of forgotten victims, The promise of science was finally at hand. The meticulous comparisons continued, the powerful algorithms sifting through countless genetic markers, looking for that one singular, undeniable link. And then the system flagged something. An anomaly, a potential hit. The very air in the lab seemed to thicken with unspoken expectation, a collective held breath. The imminence of a discovery that would not only reawaken a dormant terror, but fundamentally, irrevocably alter the course of the investigation, was no longer a distant hope, but a terrifying reality just a single agonizing click away. The meticulous process within the provincial forensics lab reached its fever pitch. Days had stretched into weeks, the precise work continuing under the unwavering gaze of Detective Inspector Don McNeil. Each DNA profile extracted from the aged evidence, each comparison against the vast criminal databases and archived samples from old suspects, was a step closer to an answer that had eluded justice for nearly 3 decades. The air in the lab, usually clinical and detached, now vibrated with a palpable, almost desperate anticipation. Technicians, their faces illuminated by the glow of their monitors, painstakingly verified every sequence, double-checked every marker. McNeil, receiving terse technical updates, felt the slow, steady drumbeat of hope quicken within his chest, a counterpoint to the logical, measured approach he had maintained for so long. Then, on August 26, 1999, the moment arrived. A data analyst, cross-referencing a new set of profiles, noticed an anomaly, a statistically improbable match. A system alert, quiet but definitive, flashed on the screen. The profile derived from the biological material collected at the Gormley crime scene, from the very presence of the killer in Doreen Morby's bedroom, aligned perfectly with a profile already in the National Criminal DNA Database. The same match was then confirmed for the samples from Margaret Ferguson's murder scene in Palgrave. The genetic fingerprint, unique and irrefutable, linked the 2 cold cases with absolute certainty, but the real shockwave was yet to come. The name associated with that DNA profile was not on the list of 3,000 suspects interviewed in 1970. It had never been on any official suspect list for these murders. The name that appeared glaringly on the screen was Ronald Glenn West. The revelation was instantaneous and devastating. The former young constable, the officer who at 23 years old had participated in the initial investigations, walking the perimeters of the crime scenes, observing the same horrors his colleagues were trying to solve. The man who had discreetly requested a transfer shortly after the second murder, moving away from the region. The man who, decades later, had quietly returned before being incarcerated for a series of violent armed robberies. The magnitude of this discovery was almost incomprehensible. It was a betrayal that resonated far beyond the shattered families, sending a cold, horrifying ripple through the very foundations of law enforcement. The individual sworn to protect and serve had all along been the very monster they sought. Detective Inspector McNeil received the call with a chilling certainty that simultaneously brought both profound relief and a deep-seated revulsion. The name confirmed his decades-long unspoken hunch that the killer was someone deeply embedded, someone whose anonymity was his most potent weapon. The sheer audacity, the chilling froideur of West, to participate in the initial investigation, to feign diligence, while knowing full well he was the perpetrator, spoke of a psychological pathology almost beyond understanding. This was not a moment of celebration for McNeil, but one of grim validation. A heavy weight finally lifted, replaced by the crushing weight of the truth. The impact of this discovery was a thunderclap. It sent shockwaves through the Ontario Provincial Police. How could one of their own have committed such heinous crimes? How could he have walked among them, feigning concern, offering theories while harboring such dark secrets? The incident forced a brutal self-examination within the ranks, a profound sense of institutional betrayal. It brought into sharp focus the insidious nature of evil, demonstrating that it could indeed hide behind a badge, within the very structures designed to combat it. The media, once informed, erupted. The story of the .22 caliber killer was no longer a cold case footnote. It was a national scandal, a chilling narrative of deception, brutality, and delayed justice that captivated the entire nation. Immediately, a team of OPP officers, led by McNeil, mobilized. Their target was Joyceville Penitentiary. On August 26, 1999, Almost 30 years to the day after the murders, they entered the maximum security institution with a formal arrest warrant for Ronald Glenn West. West, now 52 years old, his face hardened by years of incarceration for other crimes, was summoned from his cell. The confrontation was stark. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden breakdowns. Faced with the undeniable, irrefutable evidence of the DNA match, West maintained a chilling composure. He was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson. The circle of justice, so long open, had finally begun to close. The subsequent legal proceedings were devoid of the usual courtroom drama. Confronted with the overwhelming and incontrovertible DNA evidence, Ronald Glenn West eventually did what convicted murderers rarely do. He pleaded guilty. This calculated decision meant there would be no lengthy trial, no agonizing weeks of testimony, no detailed recounting of the horrific events for the victims' families to endure. It was a cold, pragmatic admission of guilt, an acknowledgement that the science had spoken and there was no viable defense. He received 2 concurrent sentences of life imprisonment with no possibility of parole. His life, already behind bars, would now end there, in the sterile confines of the penal system, a prisoner of his own monstrous deeds. For the families of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson, this declaration of guilt, though devoid of the catharsis a trial might have offered, finally brought a profound, if painful, sense of closure after almost 3 decades of agonizing uncertainty. Albert Morby, who had discovered his wife's body that terrible May afternoon, had been forced to rebuild his life, raising his infant son alone, carrying the indelible weight of those horrific images throughout the years. The news of West's identity and conviction was not a resurrection of his beloved Doreen, but it was an end to the haunting question of who. It was the culmination of a silent, agonizing vigil. He could now perhaps find a measure of peace in knowing the monster was caged. Margaret Ferguson's son, who had been a mere 9 years old when he heard the 3 dry, acute gunshots that ended his mother's life, had lived with that terrifying sound echoing in his memory for decades. He had grown up with the absence of a mother, the knowledge that a brutal killer had walked free, the uncertainty eating at the edges of his peace. Now, as a man grown, the name Ronald Glenn West finally provided the answer, the face to the nameless terror that had shadowed his childhood. It offered a tangible resolution to a wound that had festered for nearly 30 years. And Doreen's son, the infant who had been trapped beneath his mother's body, too young to form conscious memories but undoubtedly touched by the profound trauma of that day, could now learn the full story. He could finally understand that the man responsible for his mother's death, the man who had stolen his childhood with her, was now definitively behind bars, held accountable for his monstrous acts. For Detective Inspector Don McNeil, the man who had never given up, who had followed those cold, fading leads for decades, who had believed when others had filed the case away as insolvable, finally experienced the grim satisfaction of a mission completed. The thick files, once a source of quiet frustration, could now be stamped with the word every detective seeks: resolved. It was not a victory to be celebrated with fanfare, but a solemn testament to tireless dedication, to the unwavering belief that every victim deserves justice, no matter how much time passes. His persistence, his quiet faith in emerging science, had ultimately brought a predator to account. Ronald Glenn West remains incarcerated today, an aging man in a prison cell. He should have been a guardian of the law, a protector of the innocent. Instead, he chose to become its cruelest violator. He carries secrets that may forever remain buried with him, the possibility of other victims, other unsolved crimes, other families still waiting for answers that may never come. The question lingers. If he committed these 2 murders in 1970 while an active police officer, what other horrors might he have perpetrated during his long decades of freedom? But for the families of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson, and for the communities of Gormley and Palgrave that lived under the chilling shadow of the .22 caliber killer for almost 30 years, a measure of peace has finally arrived. It is not the peace that comes from forgetting, for some things cannot and should not be forgotten. Rather, it is the peace that comes from knowing, from understanding, from seeing justice, however delayed, finally rendered. The case of Ronald Glenn West serves as a stark, enduring reminder that evil can indeed emanate from the most unexpected places, that badges and uniforms do not guarantee virtue, and that the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually inevitably comes to light. It is a testament to those like Detective Inspector McNeil who dedicate their lives to ensuring that victims are not forgotten, that their stories are told, and that those who inflicted unimaginable harm ultimately face the consequences of their actions. On a warm May afternoon in 1970, two innocent women had their lives brutally stolen by someone in whom they should have been able to implicitly trust. It took almost 30 years, but the relentless pursuit of justice, the unwavering persistence of a dedicated detective, and the groundbreaking power of forensic science finally dragged that man from the shadows into the harsh light of accountability. While nothing can undo the past, while nothing can bring Doreen and Margaret back to the loving embrace of their families, at least now their stories have a definitive end. An end where the monster did not escape into the darkness, but was instead apprehended, exposed and compelled to answer for the horrors he committed. This is the enduring legacy of the .22 caliber killer, a story of profound horror, yes, but also a profound narrative of relentless justice, of resilient families, and of the unwavering promise that even in the coldest, most impossible cases, the truth will ultimately find its way. The long silence, a heavy shroud woven by deceit and time, was ultimately rent by the undeniable voice of science. For nearly 3 decades, the perpetrator, known only as the .22 caliber killer, had remained a ghost, an unsettling legend whispered in the rural towns of Ontario. Yet in the quiet, persistent work of Detective Inspector Don McNeil, and in the revolutionary advancements of forensic DNA analysis, the truth found its moment. The genetic fragments preserved for years in darkness finally spoke, naming Ronald Glenn West, an individual whose oath had been to protect, not to prey. His betrayal, chilling in its calculation, brought a raw sense of institutional shock, a stark reminder that even within the bastions of authority, malevolence can find refuge. Though the monster's freedom ended in the sterile confines of Joyceville Penitentiary, and his plea of guilt spared the families a harrowing trial, the lingering shadows of his unknown past, of other potential victims, continue to stretch long and cold across the decades. This case stands as a profound testament to the enduring human capacity for both cruelty and perseverance. It illuminates the uncomfortable truth that darkness can reside where it is least expected, masquerading behind facades of normalcy or authority. Yet it also underscores the unwavering dedication of those who, like McNeil, refuse to let forgotten victims remain unheard. It is a stark reminder that the pursuit of justice, though sometimes slow and arduous, is a relentless force, ultimately capable of penetrating the deepest shadows, bringing clarity and a measure of peace to those who have waited, yearned, and suffered. For the families of Doreen Morby and Margaret Ferguson, the peace found is not one of forgetting, but of knowing. A quiet understanding that the truth, however late it arrives, can finally bring an end to the agonizing question of who, the revelation of Ronald Glenn West's identity, a police officer, involved in the very investigation of his own crimes, is a profoundly disturbing aspect of this story. What does this betrayal say about the nature of evil and its ability to hide in plain sight? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If the complex threads of justice and hidden truths resonate with you, explore another chapter in our pursuit of answers right here. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to After the Silence for more true crime stories that echo through history.